York Shakespeare Festival, Mobile Theater will present A Midsummer Night's Dream. Tonight, in your neighborhood at 8 p.m. Admission is free. Admission is free. Tonight, in your neighborhood.
I can't be any more than 8 or 9 years old. I look outside the window, and something is going on in our park. A couple of trailers show up. They start building something. I'm 8 years old. I don't know what the hell it is.
He wanted Shakespeare to be like the public library. Free, accessible, you help people get it.
Why don't we charge admission? This is considered important to the life of the city, the educational life.
Joe Papp was saying, this is the way art should be. I mean, this is public theater that was public, was free.
I felt even a quarter would be too much.
I'm sitting there in these bleachers, and all of a sudden, there's these people in the weirdest garments I'd ever seen in my life. My father's sitting next to me, and we're just watching, Shakespeare.
We were taught by our teachers in high school that Shakespeare is hard stuff, cultural spinach.
Away, you ugly cow!
But there's Joe Papp doing it in the back of a truck in my neighborhood.
Trees, I will keep my word with thee.
And that adds something. That's a different perspective on Shakespeare. That's beautiful.
He wanted the theater to be as public as the library was. And he said if the library had not been public, he would never have discovered Shakespeare.
The theater was his pen. It was the means by which he wrote his commentary on what was going on in the society. And we were the ink.
He felt that his theater could lead an army. That he could fight the good fight. That he could put his theater on a tank and lead a division.
I must do something that has some value. I can't be in show business. I just don't do shows. They must have meaning.
The way he swam between the world of the avant-garde and the commercial world was completely admirable.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Avi Hoffman, and I could not be prouder to have with us today the writers, directors, creators of one of the most important documentary films about Joe Papp. It's called Joe Papp in 5 Acts. It's a feature-length documentary film that tells the story of New York's indomitable streetwise champion of the arts who introduced interracial casting to the American stage. He created Free Shakespeare in the Park, Hair, A Chorus Line, and over 700 productions. I would like to invite to join us Tracie Holder and Karen Thorsen. Hello,
Hi,
Tracie. Hello, Karen. I couldn't be more honored to have you with us today. We are celebrating the 100th birthday of the great Joe Papp. And your film is probably one of the most important documents of this man's life and works. So if you wouldn't mind sharing with us, please, when and how did you come up with the idea to create this film?
Take it away, Tracie.
So I am, first off, Avi, thank you so much for reaching out to us and for organizing this phenomenal celebration. It truly is extraordinary. Hard to imagine that Joe Papp would have been 100. And it's so sad that he's not here at this crucial historic moment where we need his presence more than ever. Fortunately, we do have Oscar Eustis, who has been such a true leader of the public and really carries on Joe's tradition. But in response to your question, I think your audience may be very intrigued by the answer to your question. So I am a proud New Yorker, and when I was growing up, Joe Papp was this larger than life figure on the front lines of every issue I held dear, somebody I greatly admired. But my first career was actually not in film. I was a young idealist and social activist and worked in electoral politics. And many of your viewers, I'm guessing, will remember my first boss, former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, who made her fame with Watergate and many other important, she was also a fighter like Joe. Anyway, while I was working for Liz on her campaign staff, I organized a benefit. It was an evening of works by women, about women, and it featured many of Liz's friends, Susan Sontag, John Guare, the late, great Ruby Dee, and of course, Joe Papp. And, as I mentioned, it was an evening of works by women, about women. Liz was Susan B. Anthony, Susan Sontag was Virginia Woolf, John Guare was Sojourner Truth, Ruby Dee had, I don't remember who she was, but anyway, Joe Papp called me and he wanted to read from The Merchant of Venice. And I pointed out, Mr. Papp, The Merchant of Venice is by a man, but he argued, he was a passionate man, as everyone knows, that Portia was the strongest woman in all of literature. I was a young political operative at the time. What did I know from theater? But I fought him. And in indignation, he said to me, well, then you find something. So I spent 3 days in Applause bookstore, and I found a book on the life of Emma Goldman. And I called him up and I suggested that he read from Emma Goldman. And the first time I met Joe Papp, he was Emma Goldman. Many years later, I then decided to leave electoral politics and to be political in a new way. I found my voice in film, and I realized that, to my amazement, no one had made a film about Joe Papp. So I spent several years doing research. And then at a certain point, I reached out to Karen, and then we started working jointly on the film, and the film that will air on American Masters next year is the film that we did together.
Karen, when Tracie reached out to you and said she wanted you to join her in making this film, what was your background in terms of your knowledge of Joe and the public theater? And how did you approach the project?
My own knowledge of Joe came from just being a member of his audience and being a born New Yorker and going to see free Shakespeare in the park. But my professional experience was that I went from being a journalist and a writer and screenwriter to being a filmmaker. And I think I made a documentary that had an impression on Tracie, and she reached out to me because of it. It was a film on James Baldwin, civil rights activist, best-selling author, and someone who has shaped the rest of my life, as has Joe to a degree, but I'd say James Baldwin even more. And Tracie asked me if I'd like to direct it, and eventually I invited Tracie to co-direct it along with me.
So can you describe to me, I mean, what an ambitious project, if nothing else, to look at a man like Joe Papp, who had such an extraordinary life, coming from the background that he came from, which I hope you'll talk to us a little bit about, and then accomplishing what he accomplished. How did you even begin to design the process of making this film? How did you break it down? How did you approach this very, very complex and complicated individual?
Well, research is essential, and getting to know him, as Tracie said, she spent months and years on that, and I dove in and did the same. And initially we started out with a list of the people who were part of his universe, and gradually got to know Joe himself. And I think the centerpiece of the film is exploring the nature of being an outsider and what that means in terms of being an American, and what it means in terms of being an immigrant, in terms of what it means in being Jewish. And I think we're celebrating his journey and the difficulties that he faced. And I think the hinge on which the play turns was when he finally admitted his own background, when he came to terms with owning himself. And I think that talks to the arts as the vehicle. It's the tank that Lee Brewer described, but it's also, it's the key to now. And that's why I think, as Tracie said just a minute ago, this is a time more than ever that we need this, dealing with outsiderness.
I was going to ask Tracie, you know, many of our viewers may not know Joe's background. Most people think of him just as this larger than life producer who gave the world some of the greatest theater of all time and revolutionized theater, but most people don't know his origins. Would you mind expanding a little bit about his background, his history, and how he broke through the barriers?
Absolutely. What's interesting is, as I mentioned, my background is politics. And in all honesty, I never understood why Joe Papp was in theater. He was out fighting every good fight, whether it was at the height of the AIDS crisis for more funding for research for AIDS victims, whether it was for squatters who were being evicted from homes, whether it was for public funding of the arts. He was this larger than life figure who, you know, just was out on the barricades, leading the fights. And to me, as a young woman, seeing this man, he embodied what it meant to me to be Jewish. It was standing up to injustice. But what I will say is that actually I went on my own journey in making this film, in that it was when we were interviewing the people who had gotten their start with Joe Papp, and realized, Avi, that when we filmed them, we were lucky enough to be able to film in the public theater. And so many of the people that we filmed had their first audition in the very theater where we filmed. Meryl Streep, for example. She was back in this space where her career had been launched by this man. But now she had the hindsight of 40 years to realize the significance of this man in her life. And for me, I think what I came to see was the importance of the art, much as Karen mentioned, in political activism. For me, there is no separation. My form of expression is storytelling. What I discovered, much as I still am a political activist, and there's so much that we should be fighting for, and I am still on those front lines myself, I've really come to see how storytelling and film can put a human face on a lot of abstract, wonkish policy ideas. And in the course of making the film, I think by the time I was growing up, Joe had reconciled himself with his Jewish past. I think what Karen and I were surprised to discover was that there were many, many years, I mean, decades of his life, where Joe Papp concealed his Jewish identity to the extent that his ex-wife, Peggy, a wife of decades, did not know that he was Jewish. And that was really a shocking thing to discover. By the time I was growing up, Joe was very proud of being Jewish. And as I said, he represented to me what being Jewish meant. And that was very important for me and I think for both of us, we felt exposing that conflict that so many Americans have of having multiple identities. And what does it mean to be American and to be accepted in this society where often we have to choose which side of ourselves we express.
And we couldn't have imagined it, but back in when we were making the film, and Tracie first came to me, it was, I think, 1993, and we first started filming in 2000, 2001. So it has been a long journey, but what is extraordinary now, Tracie, I think we can underline this so much, the need of the arts and the current administration actually having respect for the arts, something that America has not been wont to do. It's not been recognized as I guess, one of the more profitable commodities, but it expresses so much. So yes, this is about a message for now. It's actually really exciting. Thank you, Joe, for turning 100 right now, and for the film finally going to reach an audience when so much identity politics has taken such dark turns. I think we need some light on it.
So if you don't mind expanding just a little bit, and again, I read that Bernie Gersten, out in LA, thought that he was Irish. He was convinced that Joe was this tough Irish kid. But he came from immigrant roots. And so he dealt with an enormous amount of prejudice and anti-Semitism growing up. If you wouldn't mind expanding just a little bit about his upbringing, where it was, and the struggles that he had growing up that he had to overcome to become the great Joe Papp.
Well, like me, he was a Brooklynite, right? Born and bred, a feisty Brooklynite. And one of the things that we learned was not an uncommon immigrant story, but he came from extraordinary poverty. His parents really they both were immigrants from Eastern Europe and really, really struggled to survive in a capitalist society, in a society where, back in Poland, where his father was from, being a man was valued by your religious devotion, right? Your time spent with God and furthering your religion. But in the United States, it really was about economic survival, and his father really struggled. I mean, one of the most poignant stories that we revealed, which even to this day, as many times as I've seen the film, I get choked up every time I see this one moment where Joe Papp describes that when he was a kid, he had to work from a very early age, and that at a certain point he had a shoe shining business that his father eventually took over. I mean, their poverty was that extreme. But one of the things that I do find very moving is that thanks to the New York Public Library, Joe Papp read the works of Shakespeare. And as he makes clear, he says very clearly, and you'll see in our film, he says, why don't we charge people for books? Right? Because we feel everybody deserves access to the great works of literature. And that ideal inspired him. He never would have read Shakespeare had it not been for the public library. And so the reason the public is named that is actually the building that houses the public was New York's first public library. And Joe felt very strongly a city the size of New York should have a public theater that brought the great works of literature to audiences who had never seen live theater. And I think one of our hopes with the film is that we will reach an audience of people who may not have ever seen theater or have any interest in theater. And that Joe's message, and actually I think what I've been surprised when we've shown the film is how many young people really seem to be moved by his message. Most of them don't know his name, but his message lives on. And now Oscar Eustis really has embraced that, brings that same spirit of activism and social engagement through theater, which I've heard Oscar say is the most democratic form of arts. And so that, I think, is part of the legacy we hope the film will inspire people to remember.
I think something to add to that, I completely agree. One of the things that I quote most often when I'm talking about Joe Papp, because it's a very important thing for me to remember as a storyteller. He says early in the film, you help people get it. He didn't just make it free, he made it accessible. He took liberties with Shakespeare that took the stiff upper lip out of it and gave it to the people in a way that they could find themselves in it. And I think that's most visible in his mobile theater efforts. Then he translated to Central Park. All of his plays that were put on at the public, and even those that went to Broadway, had that same thing. You brought an element of humanity that you wanted people to actually understand, penetrate, and identify with. And that was such a gift to all of us.
You mentioned his social activism. And in most of the research that I've done, I've read a lot about how, as a young man, he was involved in many social issues. He even joined the Young Communist League when he was, a teenager. But that brings up the fact that later he was called up before the House Un-American Activities Committee and caught up in the whole McCarthy era and the blacklisting. Could you expand a little bit about that particular struggle that he had when suddenly the politics turned and how he responded to it?
Well, as he responded to everything, he was ready for a fight. He was a street fighter. He was a street tough. He never imagined himself in the arts. And when HUAC came after him, he had been a stage manager at CBS and the Red Channels, which was the publication that named, and mainly they were Jewish immigrants, right? It wasn't a coincidence that the blacklist really targeted people who were foreign born or had names that sounded not American, quote unquote. He refused to name names. He thought that was, he had a moral code and he was willing to incriminate himself, but he was unwilling to incriminate anyone else. And he was the first person CBS fired. And one of the great stories, of the many great stories about Joe Papp, and another reason to admire and love him, is that he fought his union. He demanded that his union take on the case, and he fought, and eventually CBS offered him his job back, and he told them to go to hell, and he didn't take the job. And so he was somebody, I think the thing of the, I admire, as you can probably tell, I admired him greatly, and I still do. But one of the things I really, really admired was that he was willing to stand up at cost to himself. And I'm not seeing a lot of that these days. And I really admired, when it came time, when Jesse Helms, many of your audience, I'm sure, will remember the notorious senator from North Carolina, the virulent anti-communist crusader, Jesse Helms. When Jesse Helms placed it's sort of an oath on anyone who accepted public funding that they had to sign an anti-obscenity clause, Joe Papp, who like every person in the arts was struggling desperately for money, turned down a grant of $323,000 rather than sign the oath. And as Lee Brewer says in the film, while everyone else was denouncing Helms, but taking the money because they needed it. I mean, you can't fault them. Papp was the only one who said, to hell with you, and turned down the money. And to have that kind of fierce leadership, for him, being a communist wasn't ideological. When he was a kid, he witnessed families being evicted during the Depression, at the height of the Depression, being thrown out on the street with their furniture. And the Young Communist League were street toughs, thugs, he called them, in his neighborhood, who put the furniture back in the apartment. They were fighting the good fight. And he was always on the side of the underdog. And to me, that's what it meant to be, means to be Jewish. And as Karen said, right, he identified with outsiders. So whether they were veterans returning from the Vietnam War, who now were pilloried by the left, or whether they were communists or any outsiders, people of color, he always identified and extended a hand to people who didn't have a voice. And he felt that his theater could be a theater of inclusion, a welcoming space for those who had no voice. And for so many people, that's the significance of that theater. That's what it came to represent.
I'm reminded, I don't know if this is quite a fair analogy, perhaps an exaggeration, but I'm reminded of the population of this country who seems to, in various surveys, favor certain moves toward a greater arc of justice, and yet our representatives are not always giving voice to those feelings. I feel as if Joe's audience was up against some of the critics who criticized Joe initially and then had to bend and admit that what he actually offered was great and stimulating and provocative art.
At the end of 1958, the Commissioner of Parks of the City of New York attempted to impose upon the Shakespeare Festival the requirement that admission be charged to free Shakespeare.
He insisted that unless we charge admission, we would have to leave. He's quite powerful, this man.
Robert Moses. Love him or hate him, the single most important individual force in the history of the state and city of New York.
Robert Moses built roads and parks and bridges. He was a giant of a person, both physically and in terms of the reach that he had.
For nearly half a century, this man has pushed people around New York. Almost anybody who is anybody has cursed him, fought him, knuckled under to him, and admired him.
Joe refused to knuckle under to Moses's demand.
I felt it was absolutely essential that in order to attract an audience that represented all groups, regardless of their ability to pay, and even those that could pay, to get them into the theater, to give them an experience with a living play and Shakespeare, I felt even a quarter would be too much. I feel there are public libraries that are free. I felt the city the size of New York should have a public theater.
I had the opinion that if they were going to give theater in the parks, that they ought to pay the actors the same as all other actors are paid. Not get some fella driving a taxi cab and give him $18 a week to play Hamlet. I thought then and still think that's the only basis, and that's the way it's going to end up. And when it ends up that way, they'll have to charge, because that's the only way you can get money.
Most courage comes out of fear, I'll tell you that. You're fighting to stay alive.
I never saw him back down to anybody, for size or shape or power, on any level, physical, political. He never, ever backed down.
He was kind of an art Rocky. You wanted to cheer when he got up and went and screamed for money, or when he fought Robert Moses.
There was something, I think, too, that he loved about the struggle, loved about the scrabbling. It didn't mean much if it all came easy. It didn't mean much if there wasn't a fight involved.
It was a true David and Goliath fight, and Joe played the part of David to the nines.
Moses was saying that the people were trampling the grass. You know what he got? People kept sending him grass seed.
Hundreds of New Yorkers sent in grass seed saying, here, you can plant the grass.
I was nobody, and he was a big shot. He probably found it intolerable that there's this young punk coming along and arousing so much feeling against him.
What about the Shakespeare Festival? Will it go on free?
I have anything to say about it at all.
Did you change your mind on it, sir?
No.
It's still not free, then?
I have nothing to say at all.
And then Moses pulled all the stops to leak word to the press that Joe had been a communist. Not only would he not charge admission to see Shakespeare in Central Park, but he was a communist to boot.
Finally, we took it to court. We lost in lower courts, but we won it in the Court of Appeals. We won it 5-0. The Chief Justice said that the Parks Commission was arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable.
When I went out there that opening night, the place was packed. Every seat was full. I said, ladies and gentlemen, I couldn't get any further than that. A roar, a roar. I mean, you never heard such a sound in your life. I just stood there, let it wash over me. They felt it was their triumph. The people won.
Can you tell us a little bit about not only his social justice struggles that you just described, but the idea that he had come up with this great, brilliant thought about free Shakespeare and the struggle that he had to actually make it happen? Can you tell our audience a little bit about his fighting City Hall and Robert Moses and the great bureaucracy of New York?
You know, the story is, and we don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but as Karen mentioned, you know, Joe started this mobile theater. And one thing I want to mention about the film, and one of the blessings and curses that we found as filmmakers, is that when Joe was at the height of his success with A Chorus Line and the money that was finally coming into the theater and allowing it, you know, going from deficit and crisis to crisis in a financial sense, you know, barely keeping afloat financially, all of a sudden this windfall of cash, Joe said, theater is an ephemeral art, right? You put on a play and then there is no record. And he decided one theater in America should have a documented history. And of course, that theater should be his theater. And so when he was flush with cash, thanks to A Chorus Line, he hired, and I'm not exaggerating, 4 full-time archivists. So when he died, there was this vast archive, which is now housed, thanks to Gail Papp, at the New York Public Library at Lincoln Center, the single largest collection the library has ever received. And as a result of that, much of that collection is in the form of film and video that goes back to the 1950s. And as a result, we were able to tell his story. He was able to tell his story, in fact, because we have this absolute treasure trove of archival footage that allows you to see him throughout the struggles. And obviously, the ultimate struggle is against the power broker, the legendary, notorious, often demonic and yet visionary Robert Moses, right? Who at that time was the Parks Commissioner. Now, as you mentioned, Avi, Joe Papp was a communist. He was a communist. He was a member of the party, and but as I said, an activist and not an ideologue. And as a result, Moses initially really admired Papp. He liked his gumption, his feistiness. But at a certain point, Moses unfortunately went on vacation, and his number 2 at the height of the Cold War, Stuart Constable, really wanted to get Papp, who he saw as a communist, and he was an anti-communist crusader, as many were at the time. And so after having allowed Papp to perform Free Shakespeare in the Park for several years, Constable issued a letter saying that no longer could Shakespeare in the Park continue free, that they needed to charge for the public who were going to see those plays, which obviously was anathema to everything Papp stood for and everything he was trying to achieve. So that led Papp at that time, this is in the early 1950s, was a nobody. He was just a struggling, you know, person trying to get his theater off the ground. And this is the incident that actually made him. So he and a ragtag group enlisted the help of a major law firm, Paul Weiss, and they took Moses to court. And Moses and Constable and the rest of the Parks Commission was claiming that the people who were going to see Free Shakespeare in the Park were actually trampling the grass and needed to charge money in order to pay the Parks Department the costs that they were incurring to replenish the grass. In response, a committee formed in support of Joe Papp, and it became this sort of epic David versus Goliath strike. And all sorts of New Yorkers started sending Robert Moses and the Parks Department grass seeds, saying, go plant the seeds yourself. In the end, Papp lost, was ready to give up. He had taken on the powers that be, lost, but the lawyers said, no, we take this to appeal. And amazingly, excuse me, the courts ruled in Papp's favor, describing Moses as capricious, arbitrary, and there was one other word, and Joe won. And that fight really put him on the map, gave him the press, started people putting money into this worthy, little engine that could enterprise. And Free Shakespeare in the Park, which started in 1954, has now been there more than half a century. And I couldn't be more excited or more pleased. Everybody must know that this summer Shakespeare in the Park will return, and that's just thrilling. It was devastating last year not to go. For the first time in my life since I was 16, I wasn't able to go to Shakespeare in the Park thanks to COVID. But this year, I'm gonna beg Oscar, and I'm hoping to get to see this production this year. And it's very, very thrilling to be able to know that that's coming back to our city.
I'd also add just one little detail, just for the audience, that I don't think this is in the film, but one of the things that happened, in order to have a mobile theater, Joe had persuaded the Department of Sanitation to have a truck to pull around this unfoldable mobile stage. And it was getting older and more decrepit. And whether it was by chance, coincidence, or design, it happened to break down right where he wanted to build his theater in Central Park. And that's where the Delacorte now sits. So that was a fitting coda to the Robert Moses story.
Divine providence. Yeah, he actually talked about it in the concert that he gave at the ballroom in 1978, and how the truck basically broke down, and there it was. Karen, if you wouldn't mind elaborating a little bit, let's talk about the film itself. The process, how do you even begin to plan out such an enormous undertaking as the life of Joe Papp? How did you and Tracie decide who you were going to interview, how you were going to interview, where you were going to interview, when the list is everybody?
Well, first of all, there's a cliche in the film business, which is you have to kill your darlings. So at each stage of the process, you have a much broader wish list than you can actually execute. So you gradually narrow it down. But I think we need to thank Tracie. We certainly mentioned Oscar in the Public Theater, but American Masters came into the fold during somewhere in the 90s, before we ever started shooting, and became a co-producer of the project and a funder. And they helped make it possible. So a filmmaker's journey is about research and how to tell the story, but then you have to raise the money to tell the story. And so fundraising is an important part of it, as is the scripting that goes on in a documentary is never truly a script, because the story making goes on in the editing room. But that process, once you get to filming and you've whittled that list down, you film people, and then again you have to decide which part of so many gems and so many truths that have been shared, and extraordinary people who gave of their time because of their admiration for Joe and the importance of arts for the people. This is what drove the project forward and what made it possible. So at each stage, you narrow your focus, you tighten your target, and you hope that you tell a story that is both compelling and makes people go away fired up.
I would just add, I now teach documentary filmmaking, and I've produced and I'm now directing another film. And one of the things that I really discovered in the process of making this film is one of the limitations to me of documentary is that the constraints of time, right? Our film is 84 minutes. It means that you can't have just a cavalcade of stars. You really have to be very intentional in what you're trying to convey. And therefore, I think one of the hardest decisions we faced was that there were so many people who had gotten their start, who in the theater world hadn't been touched by Joe Papp. And therefore, it became a really, really difficult process of deciding who would be in the film and who wouldn't be. We were approached by people. If we told you some of the people who wanted to be in the film, your jaw would drop. And it was painful to realize how many, that we could only have a certain number of people in the film if we wanted to have characters who you identified with, who were able to have dramatic arcs and to really tell you the story throughout Joe's life, and that you became invested in them. So that was a really, really difficult process. And as Karen said, I think initially everything seemed important. And over the years, you know, this film, as Karen's mentioned, took a lifetime and then some to make for many reasons. And one of the things that gave us, right, on one hand, it's been a nightmare. On the other hand, it gave us perspective over time to really see what were the essential things. So for example, when we interviewed Larry Kramer, right, he was able to talk about PAP's significance at the height of the AIDS crisis, and that illuminates a particular chapter and a particular narrative thread in the film that relates to Joe's son, Tony, who had a tragic demise. And, you know, we've revealed so many things in the film. I want people to still watch it, so I don't want to reveal everything. But there really was, by the end, a very intentional process. And for all those people who are not in the film, you know, please know that it wasn't personal, but that it really was to serve the film. I know that I've been in touch recently with David Henry Hwang, who I know is doing a project related to Joe, I believe. And, you know, we interviewed him and he was phenomenal, phenomenal. But in the end, his story didn't serve strategically the particular narrative we were serving. And so that's one of the things that I think is one of the hardest things as filmmakers, is to really focus on what is the story and who serves that best, who are the best people to tell the particular details, the essential themes that you want people to be left with at the end of the day. But it was
a filmmaker once told me that one way to be sure you're making a film that works is to turn off the video and just listen to the audio all the way through. And I find that particularly interesting in light of the fact that people watching this film today, so many of the people will not be names in the forefront of their public understanding of theater or acting or celebrities. And what they'll be hearing is a content, I think, that speaks to our greater society, and I'm proud of that. I think that even though the choices were painful, and frankly, David Henry Hwang's interview was terrific, I'm glad that this will speak to people on a different level, instead of kind of getting a buzz from, oh my gosh, look at who's in the film. It's, oh, maybe if they know them, look how young they were then, and then even more, listen to what they have to say.
So as we get to the end of our interview, can you quickly elaborate on the history and the future of this project? I know it's had some exposure in the past, but I know it's planning a major exposure in the future. Do you mind telling us a little bit about where it's been and where it's going?
Sure. And just one point before I respond to your question, Avi. One of the things that I thought was particularly moving, and I found myself crying several times during our interviews because I was so moved by the generosity of the people we interviewed and the perspective that they had, was that Joe was a very complicated figure. He wasn't an easy guy, and he made lots of enemies along the way. He had lots of rough edges. And what I really, really valued among the people who we interviewed is everybody described him warts and all. Nobody put him on a pedestal. They really described him as flesh and blood, and yet they loved him, knowing him for who he was. And to me, that made it so much more rich. If somebody is on a pedestal, the chances are high that I can't live that unblemished life. Like I often think of Martin Luther King, who's held up as a sainted figure, as well he should be. But I can't aspire. I'm not willing to risk my life, which King was, right? He knew he was going to be assassinated. But all of the people we interviewed talk about a man who's flesh and blood and flawed, and human ultimately. And yet he stands up for principle. He puts himself on the line. And I felt that that was, for me, an important thing for people to see, that you can be flawed, that you can be human, and yet you can still fight the good fight. And that was something I took away from one of the lessons I learned from Joe. As for the film, as you can imagine, this, as I mentioned, there's this vast, vast archive of footage. It took us years to go through this and catalog it and to make the choices. But all of that, much of that, is owned by third parties and has to be licensed. And the struggle to raise that money, and a lot of bureaucratic things and other political things that are not worth discussing here, really slowed up the film. And it is now that we are in the final stage. I think people don't realize, maybe people in the arts realize, just how much business goes into making films. The creative part is maybe 10%, but the business part is much bigger. And as Karen said, raising money is key to that. So now we have the funding, the rights are being cleared. American Masters will broadcast the film. The film had been at the Tribeca. It premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival several years ago and was seen at festivals all over the world. And it was at the Aspen Institute's Summer Ideas Festival, and it's had several prominent screenings. But now, with the rights nearly cleared, we will be able to distribute the film more widely beyond the PBS broadcast. And we're really have some very exciting ideas about a national engagement campaign, bringing it to local communities to do local programming, outdoor Shakespeare, festivals around the country, parks here in New York that shows films in the summer. But all of that will require a new and concerted effort of raising money. And so I will put in a plug that if there are any people who are watching this who feel inspired, want to see the film have a life, want to see it have Joe's legacy live on, we certainly will welcome support, and we'll be entering that chapter. We've got to finish this one first, but that is all in discussion and being envisioned as we speak.
And we should thank Avi and his wonderful organization for helping launch that.
Thank you very much. Finally, on June 22nd, it will be Joe Papp's centennial, his 100th birthday. If Joe were standing in front of you on Tuesday next week, what would you say to him?
I would hug him. He has, I don't know if people know, but in the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, there is the Walk of the Great Brooklynites, and he is there. And that is something that I feel very proud that he's represented there. But I think if he were with us today, he would be on the front lines just as he had been in the past. And I would be standing there right beside him, and I would be excited to be a part of whatever issue it was that he was tackling. And I now have had the great fortune, I've been working with Oscar Eustace, who's an advisor on my new project. John Lithgow recently recorded voiceover on my new project. So I feel that I am still part of the legacy of Joe, and still very much tied to that theater. I go to that theater all the time. And so even though he's not physically with us, I feel his presence in our city, particularly in the theater. When I go to Central Park, I mean, he may not be around, but his spirit definitely lives on.
For me, I'll be really brief. I would have, he still is on my shoulder in so many ways. That phrase, you help people get it, is my mantra on almost everything I tackle. But beyond that, I'd like to simply sit on the sideline, sit at his, the chair beside his desk, and hear what the projects are that are being pitched, the stories that are coming through to tell our story right now, to hear how he's handling the current wave of individual expression and which things he would choose. I would just be fascinated to witness that, because he he was connected. He was like connected to the electrical current that ran through society. And I know he would be today. And in fact, I hope his message serves that same purpose as we show the film.
Well, thank you so very much, Karen Thorsen, Tracie Holder, for what I think is one of the most fascinating interviews I've ever done. Obviously, I feel very strongly about the legacy of Joe Papp, who I always think of as Yossele Papierowski. I think his legacy lives on daily in the theater all over the world and will live on forever. So thank you so much, and stay tuned today for a full day of events celebrating Yossele Joe Papp at 100. Thank you
so much, Avi.
My name is F. Murray Abraham, and I believe that Joe Papp was the greatest producer of the 20th century. I don't mean just the last half of the 20th century. I'm talking about the whole century.
Hello, it's Nathan Lane, and I'm here to say happy 100th birthday to the late, great, legendary Joseph Papp.
And Joe is alive, and we are blessed to have had him in our lives, and his memory lives on forever, and his life lives on forever, and his actions live on forever. He is our true inspiration. God bless you, Joe.
Happy birthday, Joe.
Happy birthday.
That was just a taste of Academy Award winner F. Murray Abraham, Nathan Lane, Mandy Patinkin, and Catherine Brody sharing some memories of Joe Papp, the theatrical genius who revolutionized theater as we know it today. The great Joe Papp was born Yossele Papierowski, a child of poor immigrants, and he created Shakespeare in the Park, the New York Shakespeare Festival, and the Public Theater in New York City. And on June 22nd, what would have been his centennial birthday, Blythe Danner, John Lithgow, Estelle Parsons, Janelle Allen, Rex Smith, Mark Lynn Baker, and so many of the greatest stars in American entertainment will be joining me at 7 p.m. for a virtual benefit gala honoring the great Joseph Papp, followed by an exclusive virtual VIP reception. And you can join us too. Visit our website at whyilovejewish.org for all the information you need to participate in celebrating Yossele, Joe Papp at 100, a full day of events with several free programs and this once-in-a-lifetime gala and post-gala reception to benefit Why I Love Jewish.